Hi, it's Steve Hargadon, and this is the Emergency Home Learning Summit. We're doing a special set of interviews. Today we have Blake Boles with me. Hi, Blake.
Hi, Steve. Thanks for having me.
Thanks so much. Blake, tell us what you do for a living.
Before the pandemic, I spent about 12 years organizing and leading group trips for teenage homeschoolers and unschoolers, taking them all across the world and running some interesting leadership type programs in the United States also. And I'm also a writer and author. I published my fourth book, Why Are You Still Sending Your Kids to School, in May 2020.
Terrific. We always have so much fun when we talk.
I
I don't know
agree.
that I've ever asked you this question before, but what were your own learning experiences in school growing up?
I went to standard California public schools. I was a good student in the sense that I could play the game without too much effort and get good scores. And I was bored and disengaged, and I was often quietly frustrated by the inane assignments and the fact that my teachers could seldom explain why we were learning something, the forced group work, the lack of flexibility, the time wasted on classroom politics and, state standardized testing. So I could do it, but it often didn't make sense and it was frustrating. And it wasn't until college that it all kind of gelled and I realized what made school so frustrating.
Did your parents have a school story? Did they have expectations?
I think they had standard middle class American expectations of give it your best effort, look for the opportunities. But there was never much conflict because I essentially did my homework autonomously. So there was nothing to argue about. So I think I feel like I was in the pretty standard box when it came to school and what was expected of me.
You felt the frustration or the things that make sense in high school. The epiphany came in college. But how much awareness did you have in high school that it wasn't what you wanted?
Very little. I was focused on doing my schoolwork as quickly and efficiently as possible in order to maximize the time available to me to play video games and computer games and Magic the Gathering, the trading card game, and skateboard. And so I remember the feeling of Friday afternoon, Friday at 3 o'clock, 4 o'clock in the afternoon, that moment of freedom and of owning the next 2.5 days was what drove me.
You and I have talked about opening questions, questions that we ask people to start the conversation on education. Mine has been, what percentage of kids graduate from high school as competent adults? Could hold a job, start a family, live on their own. What do you think is actually happening in high school?
I think there are some productive, meaningful, engaging high school experiences. I think there are definitely some kids, some young adults out there who get out of high school what most adults imagine high school is doing and offering. But I think those kids are in the minority. And for the vast majority, high school is a holding chamber. It is a place that is convenient for parents and for society at large to put young people for a while, especially the unruly, gangly adolescents who would otherwise be wreaking havoc on the streets. It's a place to put them and to essentially give them a job so that we feel like they are being occupied in the way that we adults are being occupied. And this can take, nice shapes. This can take ugly shapes. And I think a better school is one in which adults treat young people more nicely. And maybe there's some warm, genuine friendships and relationships that are formed there. And maybe kids learn something in school. But I think it's very clear to everyone, and perhaps even more so now that parents have a view into their kids' classroom learning environment, that school is not really about learning. That there's not much retention that happens there. It's just sort of keeping kids busy and hopefully inculcating some positive work habits. I think that's the best case scenario for most kids.
You've talked about the questions that you use to start conversations with people. One that I remember is had to do with, do you actually need to go to college? What's the phrasing you use there, and how do you feel about college?
So I'm working with a group of 25 teenagers right now through this little online school, micro school that I created. And we recently had the session about post-secondary options. And I told them, listen, I could talk to you a lot about how to get into college as a homeschooler or as an otherwise non-traditional learner. But you can read that. It's fairly straightforward and shockingly easy sometimes. I think it's much more interesting to have a conversation about why you shouldn't go to college and what you could do instead. Because if we don't have that conversation, then college is just the default path. And then are you really making a choice when you decide to go to college? Are you really consenting to that? You know, my version of consent means you're aware of what your alternatives are. If you think there's only one path forward, if you decide to take that, it's not a real choice. It's not a genuine choice. And so this is where I like to initiate that conversation about like, well, why do you assume you need to go to college? Because even for the majority of young people, like the ones who I work with, who do end up going to some form of 2-year or 4-year college, if they don't see it as something that they could be doing among many good options, I think that they're not going to make the most of their time there. They're going to still feel like a prisoner to some extent of the rules that our society has given them for how to grow up and become successful.
When you work with these homeschooling, unschooling kids and activities, how many of them grew up homeschooling and how many have switched to homeschooling? And is there a difference in how you have to approach them based on that previous circumstance?
Yeah, there's interesting dynamics there because I think that the ones who went to school and then decided with some degree of volition on their own to exit out of the traditional school system, I find those the most interesting and compelling to work with because they have skin in the game. But I've worked with a lot of lifelong homeschoolers and unschoolers too. And sometimes these young people wholeheartedly embrace this philosophy, and other times, you know, that their parents, often a mom, had the idea before the kid was even born that, you know, my kid will never go to school, my kid will be unschooled. And so there's actually a certain lack of volition and consent in that situation. But no, I have not seen some large scale trend of like, you know, unschoolers who are highly resentful that their parents unschooled them. You do get a little bit of that. You do see that when unschoolers grow up and they're in their 20s and 30s. Some do say, I wish my parents had forced me to do X or Y, but that's only every once in a while. Um, and I think that it's most interesting to work with a mixed group of students who have, some of whom have been in school and others who have perhaps never touched school. And there's some good cross-pollination that happens, and that's happening right now with my micro school.
Do you feel like there are lessons from the homeschooling and unschooling world that could be really helpful to students and parents, even if they choose to stay in school?
Oh, yeah, totally. So one of my favorite institutions to talk about in the alternative learning space in the United States is North Star. And North Star is a lot like a free school in the sense that students are free to choose whatever they'd like to do, but North Star is not a school. They say, you are free to come and use our resources, hang out in our space, take classes, get mentorship, participate in, you know, this cool drama group that we have, but you have to register as a homeschooler first. And what I like about that approach is they say registering as a homeschooler is going to help you feel in charge of your kid's education and your education yourself as a young person. And that is the lesson that a serious consideration of the homeschooling path can offer to families who decide ultimately not to homeschool. It's taking that leap from saying school is this thing that is done to my kid. It's a product that we are purchasing, and we just need to find the most superior organization that offers this product. It's stepping away from that, I guess, consumer model and into this model of like, okay, fundamentally, this is our responsibility. And for the student, for the young person, it's that person saying, fundamentally, this is my responsibility, and my parents are just doing the best they can. And it's that step into responsibility and away from dependency and away from blaming the teacher, for blaming the school system, saying they failed me. I am a faulty product of this system. I want a refund. Just getting away from that mentality and saying, well, no one's going to do this but me and perhaps my family. That mindset shift is what homeschooling, at least the homeschooling that I like to think about, promotes. And that is a shift that you can take even if you choose not to homeschool, even if you remain within the most conventional school system. You start to see things as optional. It starts to become totally okay to just say no to a standardized test, to say no to homework, to not look at what you're doing as this monolithic system, but instead, like, what aspects of school are serving me and which aren't. I'm going to keep the first ones and I'm going to discard the latter.
I think it's somewhat brilliant for you to describe that, because even someone like me who's thought independently about schooling still hears all the voices of, well, no, you can't do that.
Yeah, I hear that too. It's and that's what's tough for parents who have grown up in conventional schooling, which is most of them. It's this dance that you do with your kid and with the school system, and if you don't, the word in the community I'm part of is deschool. If you don't deschool yourself, then you're going to continue to bring those little worries and doubts and assumptions, and that can poison the well, so to speak.
Blake, is there a comparable circumstance in which people go through a similar transition in thinking? I'm wondering if this shift from to eating more healthy food is comparable. Feels like they're similar things that have to change in thought patterns. There's a fair amount of individual initiative that's required. What's the most comparable circumstance to taking charge of your own learning that exists outside of schooling?
I love the employment and self-employment analogy. And Ken Danford, who's the co-founder of North Star, which I was just talking about, he has this great quote, which is that when a teenager is given all this freedom for the first time, it can be overwhelming, and they might say, hey, I would like to have my 40-hour-a-week job back, please. That is what can happen to young people when they do leave the conventional school system with all of its boundaries and constraints and rules. The freedom can feel a bit overwhelming and a bit oppressive even. And it's in the same way that people who jump headfirst into self-employment after working for a boss, working for a larger organization for a long time, they will feel that same sense of dread and being overwhelmed. And so when people say, well, is self-directed learning for everyone? Is unschooling for everyone? These wild alternative schools where kids can do almost anything, are they for everyone? I like to say no, in the same way that self-employment is not for everyone, but it sure is for a lot of people. And a lot of people dream about it. And I think that's a good dream to have. It's a good aspiration because you get to control the processes of your life and the way you're spending the majority of your waking hours. And that's a really important thing. And even if you don't get to that point of being fully self-employed, even if you never start your own business or decide to become a freelancer, just thinking about that and dreaming about that, I believe that is a good and noble direction to go. for a lot of people. But yes, a lot of people will also ultimately not choose that because the freedom and the responsibility can be highly scary and anxiety provoking.
That's really fascinating. Blake, did you have a teacher or a mentor in your who you feel really changed your life?
I didn't have any teachers in school with that close of a connection, but there was a summer camp director who played that role for me. And his name was Jim Wiltons, and he's the director of a small family-run wilderness summer camp in Northern California called Deer Crossing Camp. And I went there for 4 summers, starting at age 11. And the 2 weeks that I would spend at that summer camp, where he calls it a high challenge camp, which means you go there to do stuff and be challenged. It's not like a resort, kick back and relax type camp. The 2 weeks that I would spend at Deer Crossing over the summer, I really felt like I learned more of the really important stuff, the fundamental stuff, than I did in the 9 months of traditional school that I would then return to. And there's a lot more I could say about that camp, but the most important thing that I learned from Jim and from the instructors that he trained was the importance of attitude. And that it sounds a little cheesy to say, but it really, I still believe it, and I think it does matter. And it's not about being a cheery, naive optimist. It is about being someone who has constructive solutions to any problem that life throws at you. So I'm very indebted to Jim Wiltons. And I went back to work for him for a number of summers in college and shortly after. And that was a whole nother layer of growth for me.
There's something deeply profound about that, right? Where you have confidence that no matter what comes up, you can figure it out versus a constant dread of not measuring up. Have I articulated what he did for you?
Yeah, there is a connection between that attitude stuff and the self-directed learning stuff. And it's funny because Jim in his summer camp, he mostly works with normally schooled uh, young people from the San Francisco Bay Area. It doesn't attract or breed uh, alternative education paths in any way that I can measure. And so there's some overlap there, but the Venn diagram still has some, there's some separation there. And so that little space in between, that's what I've been trying to work on, I guess, in my adult career, trying to bring in these principles of I guess, entrepreneurship and positive attitude, and bring those into the realm of education where I mean, education just seems so backwards from the perspective of promoting entrepreneurship, the values of entrepreneurship, promoting the positive self-image or self-esteem or constructive attitude that I picked up at this high challenge wilderness summer camp. Trying to bring those elements together, that continues to be the challenge for me, Steve. I'm trying to figure it out anew each year.
Do you have a personal philosophy as to how you influence another person?
I think I have the most influence on teenagers who I get to work with in a face-to-face, often kind of small group environment. And so that has been on my Unschooled Ventures international programs. It's also been through my work at the summer camp, Not Back to School Camp, which is for teenage unschoolers. And I think it is that attitude thing. I think what I've heard the most in feedback is, my kid came away inspired. And that's what I'm hoping to do, is to to not let there be another generation of little cynics being raised. And I feel like there's so much cynicism that is bred by the conventional school system. And so much just like checking out that happens just even in middle school. And this idea that learning stuff and being ambitious about things and having genuine curiosities, that's just relegated to the brown nosers. That's just such a destructive philosophy. And so I feel like what I've been able to offer in my best moments is this sense of genuine hopefulness for the future and inspiration and desire to learn things and grow and push yourself just for no other reason beyond like growth feels good. So that's what I aim to do, Steve.
I love it. So before we started recording, you talked about this New York Times article. Can you take the school out of homeschooling? Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
It was nice to see some positive press for homeschooling and unschooling in the New York Times, which is often on the other side of the spectrum. And I really love the title of that article because it was a good thing to come out when everyone is going back to school, going back to virtual school in fall 2020. And there was a lot of parents considering homeschooling. And with that consideration comes the default assumption that homeschooling is about school at home. And so just the title of that article might have done a lot of good, even if people never read much into the content, because home education is a great phrase. We don't use that much. Unschooling is a terrible, terrible word that we just seem to be stuck with. And I propagate that word. I take full responsibility for that. And so this idea of home education, not home schooling or home learning, there's so many different iterations of it. That is the right direction to go, away from the default assumption of school at home and toward self-directed learning. I'm still waiting for a better little quick one-line description. Steve, have you run into any superior terminology in all of the interviews you've been doing?
Well, we did call this the Home Learning Summit,
Mm-hmm.
I think for the same exact reasons. And I've written a piece on the game of school and the difference between schooling, training, education, and learning.
Yeah, it's a
I
great
think
piece.
we're not good about using those terms carefully. But when we do, it kind of opens up some doorways to understanding that learning takes place all the time, and it's not necessarily because you're in school or because you're in some formal training. But I really agree with you, and I think we're historically at a moment where we're having a conversation about all of these things, a conversation that is unique to the time and really worth having.
Agreed.
You made me think of Ivan Illich's Deschooling Society, sort of the idea that the schooling system gets replicated in all areas of our life. And then Matt Hearn wrote a book, I think, called Deschooling Self. Do you find that students who have been in traditional schools have to go through a deschooling process?
Yeah, almost universally. Uh, the rule of thumb is spend 1 month deschooling for every year that you've been in school. So if someone's coming out of school in 8th grade, give them 8 months to de-school, to not do anything that looks necessarily like productive activities or academics for those 8 months. And that rule of thumb seems to hold true. Um, the more difficult path is for the parents. They may have 30 or 40 years of not just schooling, but also workplace assumptions to begin to question and revise. But yeah, that's definitely true. I don't think there's any easy way. There's no switch to flip to go from in a highly extrinsically motivated learning mindset right into one where you do things for their own sake and you think more broadly about your future. It takes time and often a lot of anxiety and suffering. Like, uh, I guess I don't want to be too much of a cynic or pessimist at this moment, but I've seen the process of becoming an unschooler can be a very trying and difficult one for the young person involved, especially for adolescents. That's who I primarily work with, who are so oriented to their peers and who look at the friends that they had in school who are now continuing to go on and do what appears to be productive, measurable learning and achieving societally validated outcomes. And if this kid left school in 8th grade and all of her friends went on to school in 9th grade, and now she's kind of sitting at home doing things that are interesting to her, but also feeling a bit listless for part of her days, that can be a tough situation, mental health wise, especially if she's isolated, especially if there's not many other people to connect with face to face. And that continues to be the challenging reality for a lot of young people who do opt out of the conventional school system. And I know a lot who have come close, and they would be star unschoolers, but they say, I want access to friends. I want access to face community. And really, I have no way to contradict those young people. I'm like, yeah, I get it. That's a really important thing. And if you go to school, at least you still have access to these people, because otherwise you're living in this rural area and you're going to be essentially home alone all day. I get it. So even in the United States, where we have the most homeschoolers, the most unschoolers, the best chance to find these support networks, these communities, these camps, these programs, it is still a very isolating and lonely and challenging experience for a lot of young people who take these very self-directed paths.
If I'm a parent or a student, if I'm a parent of a teenager or I'm a teenager and I'm learning at home remotely and I'm not having a good experience, I'm not having a good time, is there immediate advice that you would give me? What could you say to me or to the parent that would make a difference if they're just feeling like this isn't working?
The struggle is real. Uh, being stuck at home, not being around other people face to face, having to do everything through this little glowing rectangle, like this is not a natural or desirable situation. This is something I've had to come to accept for myself, with migrating some of my work online and just really feeling disappointed by the quality of interactions that come through online classes. It's not the same, and that's going to lead us to feel crappy about the experience. And so I think it's normal to feel bad at this moment in history, and there's a certain level of stoic acceptance of this fact. I'm not sure if that's what you wanted to hear, Steve, but that's what's been on my mind.
Well, I kind of feel like your message is, yeah, this is hard, but you actually can take control. You don't realize it, but you're in a position to make the decisions you want to make, and it will be breaking all of these expectations that you have had before. But you can make your own future. You can find things to do. You don't have to just be a victim.
Yeah, and this is true whether or not people are being forced to do remote learning. But I guess I'm gonna roll with what you said, and if we are forced to be at home and not be able to interact face to face with peers, then maybe this is a great time to try ditching the remote learning, the curriculum based school at home, because who are you doing this for? Uh, if your main benefit from school is the face-to-face interactions and school is not giving that to you right now, then step away from it. I think that this is an incredible time to try and experiment with higher levels of self-directed learning. That doesn't mean you have to go whole hog unschooler. You can still have you can still keep the elements of structured learning that you do find engaging and meaningful, and you can ditch the rest. And I think that a lot of bets are off right now with school systems. Like, they understand that this is a tough time for students. And so if you decide, if you say, we're gonna homeschool, for the rest of this year, the rest of this school year, there's a very high chance that you will be met with a higher level of acceptance and empathy than a school official might give you in a regular year. And so, yeah, you're right, Stephen. Thank you for bringing me back to my more default constructive self, which is, this is a great moment to try self-directed learning, which may still look like home-based learning and online learning, because our options are just limited right now. But if you're sitting in front of a Zoom screen for 6 hours a day and you're 14 years old and you feel your brain dribbling out your ear, you don't have to put up with that situation. You don't. And this might be the best time to do it with the minimal possible downside, the minimal possible ramifications for leaving the school system and then deciding you want to rejoin it again at a later point.
You've just given me the title for this interview. We'll call it, "Is Your Brain Dribbling Out of Your Ear?" Thank you, Blake. That's terrific.
Thank you, Steve.